The Vengeance of the Witchfinder by John Bellairs, Chapter 1. The young, blue-eyed police officer blinked in surprise, and he smiled and saluted, touching the narrow brim of his bobby's helmet with respect. "Good morning, Mr. Holmes," he said in a loud, cheerful voice. "It's wonderful to see you back in London, sir, if you don't mind my saying so." Louis Barnevelt could feel himself blushing. A chubby blond boy of about 13, Louis stood with his Uncle Jonathan on the sidewalk of a bustling London street. Louis suddenly felt very silly in his blue windbreaker, brown corduroy pants, and checked deerstalker hat. He mumbled, "I'm not really Sherlock Holmes." As soon as he said it, he felt twice as foolish as before. The bobby pretended astonishment. "No? Why, I apologize, then. You must forgive me, sir. I simply assumed that you were the great detective traveling incognito. You see, Mr. Holmes was a master of disguise." "I know," said Louis. "I know," said Louis. "We're looking for Baker Street, where he and Dr. Watson lived. This is my Uncle Jonathan Barnevelt, and I'm Louis Barnevelt. We're from America, and I am Police Constable Henry Dwiggins. I am happy to meet you both. Good morning to you, sir," said the bobby. He gave Uncle Jonathan an amiable nod. Jonathan did not notice. He was trying heroically to refold the street map of the city. "Hello yourself," he said in a grumpy voice. Though no one could tell just by looking at him, Jonathan Barnevelt was a wizard, not a wicked sorcerer, but a gentle, bearded, heavy-set, easy-going magician who could conjure up wonderful three-dimensional illusions. Unfortunately, he could not conjure up the ability to read a map well, or to refold it neatly. "We're lost," he confessed to the young policeman, "and my sense of direction has deserted me. Could you please help us find Baker Street?" The constable smiled. "Of course, sir. A good many Yanks come looking for Mr. Holmes's flat, and I have pointed them in the right direction. I like Americans. Have ever since I flew with them during the war. As it happens, I am off duty now. I'll show you the way if you wish." "Thank you very much." Jonathan's unsuccessful but athletic efforts to fold the map made his red hair and bushy beard bristle. A light breeze caught the fluttering paper and flipped a corner of it into Jonathan's mouth. He spat. At last he gave up. He simply crushed the map into a more or less flat rectangle, which he thrust into the back pocket of his khaki wash pants. He wore brown walking shoes, a red vest over a blue open collared shirt, and a rumpled gray tweed jacket. "You are most kind," Jonathan boomed, sounding much more friendly now that the map was out of his way. "Of course, Louis and I know that Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson were just fictional characters, but we thought it would be fun to explore their neighborhood." The officer's eyes twinkled. "Of course, sir. But come to that, fictional characters of that sort are a bit realer than you and me, if you take my meaning. I mean, look at me now. In 100 years, who will come looking for my house? Nobody. But you can be sure that people will still be searching for Mr. Holmes's flat at 221B Baker Street. Now, if that isn't being real, I don't know what is." "Could you please tell us where Sherlock Holmes might have lived?" asked Louis. He normally was timid in the presence of strangers, but he sensed that the young policeman shared his enthusiasm for Sherlock Holmes tales. "Well, I have an idea or two." Constable Dwiggins nodded twice. "If I'm right, he lived rather close by. Come along with me, and you may see what I mean. You have to understand, though, that these old streets have suffered through a lot of changes. Since the 1890s, they have been renumbered and bombed and built back up and renumbered again. So your guess may be quite as good as mine." The three strolled along for a few blocks. It was a cloudy, cool morning in late June of 1951. This was the third day of a 6-week European vacation that Louis and his uncle were taking. Originally, they had planned for Uncle Jonathan's neighbor and best friend, Mrs. Florence Zimmerman, to join them, together with Louis's friend Rosarita Pottinger. Then Rosarita had broken her ankle. She could not go on the trip because she would have to wear a cast for about 6 weeks. Mrs. Zimmerman had considerably decided to stay home in New Zebedee, Michigan, to keep Rosarita company. Though Louis missed both Mrs. Zimmerman and Rosarita, he had to admit that even without them, the trip had been, well, maybe the best word was exciting. Jonathan and Louis had traveled by bus and train from New Zebedee to New York. From there they had flown on an airliner to London. Louis had fretted the whole way. What if one of the airplane's engines stopped working halfway across the Atlantic? What if fog covered the airport when they arrived? and the pilot crashed the plane into the ground? What if the crazy British traffic, which all moved on the wrong side of the street, got them into a dreadful automobile accident? Of course, none of these awful events had happened, but Louis was a worrywart and could not help dreaming up possible disasters. At least he always got a pleasant feeling of relief when his worst fears failed to come true. On Monday, Louis and his uncle had arrived safe and sound at their London hotel. They had spent one day resting, and today they were out to see the sights. "Now," said Constable Dwiggins suddenly as he came to a halt at a street corner, "here we are on Baker Street. Look around, Louis, and see what you can observe. I've no doubt you know Holmes's methods." Louis did as he suggested. On both sides of the street stood rows of three-story buildings, stone-fronted and respectable. At first, nothing appeared unusual about anyone. Then Louis's eyes narrowed. "It must be that one," he said, pointing to the second floor of an apartment building on his side of the street, nestled between the offices of a dairy and a driving school. "Wonderful, Mr. Holmes," the policeman said with a warm chuckle. "My thoughts exactly. You see the reason, of course." Louis thought carefully. "I can see at least 3 different reasons," he replied at last. "Bravo!" Uncle Jonathan laughed. "Well, I must be about as dense as Dr. Watson. I don't see anything about this building that makes it any different from the others. If it isn't too much trouble, would you please tell me what I am missing?" With a broad smile, Constable Dwiggins nodded to Louis and asked, "Would you care to enlighten the gentleman, Mr. Holmes?" Louis put his hands behind his back, the way Sherlock Holmes often did in the stories, when he began to explain his deductions. "First," he said, "that apartment house faces east. In The Adventure of the Dancing Men, Holmes held up a paper so the sunlight fell upon it, and that was in the morning. That means the windows of Holmes's flat had to look out to the east." "First rate," said Dwiggins. "Go on." A small but noisy truck rumbled by, giving Louis a chance to think about his next point. When the clamor died down, Louis said, "You will notice the front door of this building has a semicircular fan light over it. So did the door of 221B. Watson mentions that detail in The Adventure of the Blue Carbuncle." Jonathan shook his head, making his beard waggle. "How on earth do you remember all that?" he asked. "I've read all of Conan Doyle's stories myself, but oh well. What is the third reason, my dear fellow?" Louis turned and pointed across the street. "In The Adventure of the Empty House, Watson says an empty building was directly across from 221B. This is the only house that has another one directly opposite it. The others are sort of off-center." "Right you are," said Dwiggins. "Good work, Mr. Holmes." "Have I missed anything?" asked Louis, unable to keep from grinning broadly. Constable Dwiggins returned his grin. "Oh, 1 or 2 minor items, but I can't fault you for them. For instance, I have learned that this is the only house in this part of Baker Street that has a backyard where the famous plane tree could grow. And I happen to know that the stairway has exactly 17 steps leading up to the first floor. Sorry, you Yanks call that the second floor, I believe. Now, it's true that the flat does not sport a bar window. However, Colonel Moran must have smashed the original window when he fired his air gun through it. Either that or the German bomb shattered it during the war. Either way, the present owners must have replaced the broken bow window with a regular window." Jonathan raised his hands in surrender. "I give up," he said. "Take me away. Plane trees and bow windows and 17 steps mean less than nothing to me. But then, I'm as thick as a London fog and as blind as an American bat." Both Constable Dwiggins and Louis laughed. "Not at all, sir," said Dwiggins. "And I apologize if you feel left out by all this. It takes a real Sherlock Holmes fanatic to understand the excitement of tracking down the exact location of 221B Baker Street." Constable Dwiggins had to go then, but before he left, he gave Louis and Jonathan several helpful hints about what to see in London. Then he and Louis exchanged addresses so they could write to each other about Sherlock Holmes. Louis felt a little sad after the young police officer had gone. It was fine to pretend to be as dashing and as brilliant as Sherlock Holmes. Unfortunately, when he stopped pretending, Louis had to admit that he was not like him at all. His friends at school often made fun of him because he was fat and something of a bookworm. In fact, Louis thought, he resembled the middle-sized, strongly built Dr. Watson more than he did the tall, athletic Sherlock Holmes. Still, it was fun to assume the role of Holmes, as he had just done. At such times, even one or two gloomy thoughts could not completely ruin his good mood. Louis and Jonathan went on from Baker Street to visit the British Museum. After they had dropped into some strange little shops and narrow back streets where Jonathan browsed among musty, cluttered shelves, he was searching for some mythical-looking talisman to give to Mrs. Zimmerman as a present. Years before, Mrs. Zimmerman had specialized in studying the magic talismans at the University of Göttingen in Germany. She collected all sorts of mysterious knickknacks. Jonathan eventually found a small stone scarab that dated all the way back to ancient Egypt. It was an elaborate little carving, a realistic beetle with some flecks of blue and black enamel still showing on its wings and legs. After some dickering with the shop owner over the price, Jonathan bought it. Outside the shop, he held it up and said to Lewis, "According to the shopkeeper, this little doohickey is about 3,000 years old. I think Mrs. Z ought to like it, don't you?" "Sure," said Lewis. "I bet she doesn't have anything like that in her collection." "I know she hasn't," replied Jonathan. He put the scarab back into its little box. Then he sighed. "Of course, it isn't what I would really like to give her." Lewis knew what his uncle meant. Mrs. Zimmerman had once been a more powerful magician than Jonathan Barneveld. Jonathan could only create illusions, but Mrs. Zimmerman could actually work magical transformations. At least she could until she lost her witchy powers in a fight with an evil spirit about a year and a half earlier. She had saved Lewis's life in that battle, and she always said that she had no regrets. Still, both Jonathan and Lewis suspected that she missed her magic more than she admitted. If Jonathan had been able, he would have given Mrs. Zimmerman a very special present. He would return her lost magical talents to her. But he could not find a way to do that. Now both Jonathan and Lewis felt a little sad, so they went back to their hotel, planned the next day's tour, and turned in early. And that's the end of chapter 1.